Welcome everyone to today's Virtual Digital Economy seminar. Before I introduce today's guest, let me, as always, give you the organizational details very briefly. So most of you will know this by now. We would ask you to send any clarifying questions to everyone in the chat window throughout the talk. I will then manage the queue and interrupt our speaker at a convenient time. For you to ask a question, unless you prefer for me to ask the question for you, which you can also let me know in the chat. We will collect all remaining questions for the Q&A after the talk in the same way, so don't hesitate to post questions at any time in the chat window. Today's session will be recorded, so if you do ask a question, you will appear in that recording. But now to the part we're all interested in. We are very happy to welcome today's guest. Gordon Burtch is an associate professor for information systems at Graduate School of Business in Boston at Boston University. I'm super looking forward to his talk. He will talk about personal social networks, technology skills, and worker performance under telework. Very, very timely issue. So Gordon, you have 45 minutes, then we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A after that. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm excited to present this work as well to this audience. And my experience so far presenting this work is that everyone can relate, everyone has an opinion, and so I'm really curious to hear thoughts. It's a good brainstorming session quite often. Just my co-authors on this work are Miguel Godinho de Matos, who's at Católica Lisbon, and Francisco Lima, who's currently the head of Statistics Portugal, INE, and he's also affiliated with IST, the Technical University of Lisbon. I'm obligated to say that the content of this presentation are not endorsed by Statistics Portugal in any way, at least until they publish their own report based on the results. And one other final caveat I will note, because sometimes it's a little contentious. We refer to this as personal social networks, but I'll be clear upfront, what we're actually talking about are cohabitation networks, because that's what we can identify in our data well, okay? Just for context. Now, motivation is essentially this, and I think all of us have a great deal of experience at this point with remote working relationships, as is evidenced by this seminar series. This is a plot based on data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but the shape of this plot is quite similar across much of the world. It's been estimated by Nicholas Bloom and colleagues that in the lead up to the COVID pandemic, something like 5% of paid full work days were conducted remotely in the United States, and the number rose to about 45% as of March of 2021. Now, the numbers have started to come back down a bit since the peak of the pandemic. That said, I think the general consensus is that remote work is sort of here to stay in one form or another, and it will continue to rise, perhaps at a more rapid pace than it was previously, now that many employers and workers have come to realize that their jobs can be done remotely and relatively effectively. So in the top right, I'm showing you a plot based on a report that was published by Indeed.com, which is a job posting website, showing the steady uptick in jobs making mention of remote work and hybrid work as part of the terms of the employment. Obvious reasons why firms may prefer to make this shift if they can make it work. It lowers costs and things, and maybe offers some flexibility for them in terms of who they can employ, for instance. Now, there are, of course, a lot of challenges with managing a hybrid or fully remote workforce that we're not really talking about here, but many employers are struggling to figure those things out at the moment. Scheduling, et cetera, coordination problems that arise, and maybe innovation gaps that can result in the long term if people are not having water cooler conversations and things. These are all fodder for future questions to address. On the worker side, a lot of workers are now expressing a very explicit requirement that they be afforded some degree of remote work as part of their employment terms. On the bottom right, I'm showing you the results of a survey that was conducted with, I don't know if I would refer to them as a representative set of workers, but industry type survey to understand if your employer demanded that you return to work tomorrow, as Elon Musk has just done with Tesla yesterday or something like this. How would a typical worker respond to that? And 2/3 say that they would return. A smaller fraction say they would quit and immediately look for new work. And then a good chunk, 1/3 of them have said, I'd go back, but then immediately start looking for a new job. By some estimate, workers would be willing on average to accept an 8% reduction in pay to be able to maintain remote work terms. And that's substantial, right? So a large fraction of individuals want to maintain remote working relationships, and whether they want it or not, an increasing fraction of employment opportunities will embed this in some form or another. And the European Commission's JRC sort of report series, they've generated some forecasts of expected skills that'll be needed in the labor force over the next several years. And it's interesting, if you look at this chart, one of the main skills that they note is actually telework. And that's probably a bundle of things. But the point is that this is here to stay, and it's going to be quite important going forward. So we need to plan for it as a government planner and also potentially as a firm, thinking about the skill sets of employees. Now, an interesting point here is that despite a large majority of workers expressing an interest in maintaining remote work of some form and employers wanting it as well, the accounts are not uniformly positive in terms of how remote work went for everybody during the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, 40% of workers have reported that they perceive themselves to have been more productive in this sort of working relationship. Consistent 5 to 10% are saying that they would strictly want to be back in the office if they can be. And something like 15% of the workers under COVID-19 pandemic are sort of saying that actually they think it didn't go well at all. And that it was much worse than their former working setup used to be in terms of their productivity. Now, again, this is just a worker's perception. This says nothing about what's the objective truth in terms of productivity, and things like innovation gaps and collaboration may have suffered. But the point is there's a lot of heterogeneity here in terms of how people fared. Okay, and so it's important to think about where does that heterogeneity come from and how can we think about planning for it and managing it if this is going to be a new normal. So there are multiple streams of literature that address factors that may influence workers' ability to succeed under remote working relationships. They're not always well integrated with each other, and they're often pursued in parallel. So you think about like organizational psychology versus economics, of course, have tackled different aspects of this. But you can think about trying to categorize some of these things into a few groups. So one aspect of this is sort of the objective physical environment in which a worker operates. So things like the physical workspace somebody has at home, and if they have enough dedicated workspace such that they're not operating in conflict with somebody else in the household, which would have especially been an issue during COVID for many people. There's physical infrastructure as well related to internet connectivity, the quality of that. And on the employer side, the employer's investments in supporting ICT that would enable remote working relationships. And this could be the ICT itself. It could also be training around the use of these tools, cybersecurity practices, VPNs, cloud services, et cetera. Of course, there's a lengthy body of work in econ that talks about the types of work that can be done remotely in tandem with things that could be automated. So these kind of are two big questions that have come up in that literature. And a lot of this is just tied to essentially the job characteristics. We're going to rely on some of the measures that have come up in that literature in the present study, especially measures that come from ONET job surveys that characterize job characteristics, or sorry, characterize jobs in terms of their features, the types of work that people are doing. I think the simple intuition here that some jobs can be done online more easily than others. It remains quite difficult to drive a bus on the internet, but I can do several other things, knowledge work especially. Online is more capable of being digitized. What we're really focused on in this work, however, are characteristics of the worker themselves. And so I know I told you a second ago that we're not really we will use aspects of job characteristics in the present study. We will actually use those to construct some of our measures of the degree to which a worker likely possesses technology and computing skills. Okay. And the point will be, we want to understand the role of technology skills in a worker's ability to succeed and perform well in a remote working environment. And more importantly, where they acquire those skills. Yes.
I'm sorry. So will you look at the interaction between, did you mean that, the interaction between worker characteristics and job characteristics, or?
So actually what I mean is we're framing our study in the main variable of technology skill, the way we operationalize it. At one point, we're going to focus on an operationalization that is based on the job characteristics of the job you have. We will also look at an education-based measure of the computing skills you likely have, but really it's not the interaction, it is the characteristics of the person, and namely the skill set they hold.
Thanks.
And similarly, the skill set held by other people in their cohabitation network. We're going to try and get to those spillover effects if they exist. Okay. Now, when we start thinking about the role of technology skills, the immediate thing that will come to mind are things like, how do I plug in my Wi-Fi router? How do I log into Zoom? How do I use Google Cloud Docs? These kinds of things. The point we're making here is that, well, some of that likely does play a role, most certainly does play a role here. It can go beyond this. It can go to work routines and ways of working. Digital literacy is not just about understanding physical hardware and software. It's also about understanding, how do I navigate the internet? How do I find relevant information? How do I process information? How do I communicate with others, manage my time when I'm not in a structured workplace, et cetera? And interestingly, there's, at least a small number of startups that have popped up under the COVID-19 pandemic that are very much focused on this idea of upskilling workers in a way that specifically enables them to do well in remote work. So Workplaceless is one example of this. They offer these skills training exercises, not just for workers, but also for managers and team leads, as well as organizations to think about how to design processes and manage the company for a remote workforce. Now, with most technology in the workplace, often there are skills gaps. So not every worker will inherently know how to make use of a particular technology at work. And how would that traditionally be addressed in the workplace? Formal training exercises, communities of practice, mentors, things of this sort. The point here is, if I am not physically in the workplace, then those typical mechanisms for addressing skills gaps may become strained, because while I can schedule a meeting with somebody else, I no longer have ad hoc interaction, casual interaction, where I can seek help and support. And our main supposition here is that workers, absent that, may be more likely to draw on who is around, people that live with them. And so this motivates our question of, to what extent will you see spillovers within cohabitation networks in terms of the skills, ICT skills benefits? So if I do have a cohabitant that has skills when I'm lacking them, to what extent will that help me maintain my productivity and value to my employer in the workplace? And can we quantify that? Okay, so our study context, we are focusing here on the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this began in March of 2020 in most parts of the world, started a little bit earlier in Asia. And we're focused on Portugal. We will actually look at the second phase, the second lockdown that happened in Portugal as well, just for some validation that the effects are really tied to this event. And it lasted roughly 2.5 to 3 months. So it began in March of 2020 and extended through early May of 2020. These restrictions on movement were put in place by the Portuguese government. Some estimates basically indicate that every job that could be conducted remotely was conducted remotely when this happened. And this is important because we're trying to basically make the claim that the assignment into remote work was not endogenous to the worker. It's something that was imposed on the worker by the employer out of necessity to maintain business operations. This is actually an important point as well, because a lot of the prior work that has been done on remote working has been focused on groups that self-select or volunteer. There are some exceptions to this, but the vast majority of work is subject to this self-selection. We're talking about roughly 40 to 50% of workers started working remotely when this happened. Okay. I'll explain our research design in a minute, so just bear with me. For the moment, though, I want to start off explaining our outcome variable. So the thing that we're going to argue is a reasonable proxy for the productivity or performance of a worker. What this really is, and I think the way to think about this is it's a proxy for the value the employer placed on the worker. So the belief that the worker was adding value to the firm, which may or may not have been exactly aligned with objective productivity, but it's what we're working with. So essentially, when the COVID-19 pandemic started and these restrictions on movements were put in place, everybody was pushed into remote work that could be. And then a lot of firms were facing cash flow challenges at this time. The economy started to suffer quite a bit. And so as a result, some emergency measures were put in place by the Portuguese government, such that any firm that experienced a rapid decline in revenue of at least 40%, they could apply for government support for wages for their workers. And they could implement what was known as a simplified layoff, which is essentially a furlough. So workers would have their wages reduced to 2/3 of their base salary. They would be sent home. 30% of that 2/3 would be paid by the employer. The other 70% would be paid by the Portuguese Social Security Administration. This is important because these furloughs essentially show up in the wage data as reductions in base wages. The collective bargaining situation in Portugal is such that you will not see reductions to base wages, except through this kind of thing, like a furlough or a leave, or if the employer and the employee agree on it bilaterally. It's challenging to implement a reduction legally otherwise in Portugal. So this is really what we're trying to pick up on. Were you furloughed or not? And this will show up in the wage data. So our wages are monthly gross wages. This is what we're focused on. And you see a plot here where I'm showing what was going on between what I will explain. I'll explain this telework measure in a minute. Low teleworking workers versus high. This is an employer measure of low versus high rates of telework among employees in the firm. The pattern is quite similar between the two, although the average levels of wages are obviously different. Essentially, wages were rising year over year, and we can show this with historical wage data as well, until the year 2020, where you see with the onset of the first COVID-19 pandemic, there is this inversion that happens and wages start to drop. And this was true for all workers across the economy, okay? So what we're gonna be estimating here is not who does better wage-wise than whom else. Actually, it's a better way to think about this is who suffered less. So everybody suffered, but the question is, did you suffer as badly or not? We're really focused on that heterogeneity.
So Gordon, sorry, can I, because
yeah, no, please.
So to what extent will it matter that some jobs could actually, go to remote work and others, there was no way? Or will you get into that much more? Yeah, so on the one hand, this is, of course, like a local population. There's only some group of people we can really talk about. On the other hand, that's the population we probably care about going forward. We will have things like actually we'll have individual fixed effects in here, which will subsume the job fixed effects. So this is within a job. Who's doing better, who's doing worse. Not everybody was assigned to remote work right away necessarily, but the point is we're going to have, I know I said virtually everything that could be put into remote work was, but the reality is within these job codes, we do have some variation. So you could have the exact same job code, but you got sent home and you did not. And we can compare your performance as a function of the skills of other people in your household, for example, which will vary as well. Does that make sense? So this is my research design here, so I can maybe explain. Yeah, yes, perfect. There.
Okay, so ultimately, at the end of the day, what we end up estimating here, you can think about this as a quintuple difference. So it's somewhat convoluted. So the main thing here is, first off, we need to deal with the effect of COVID-19 on wages, which is obviously going to be very challenging. We have to make sort of a simplifying assumption that whatever COVID-19 does to people's wages, it has sort of a linear additive effect. And so you may not believe that. I don't know that I even believe that. But the point is, this is what we need to assume to be able to estimate something that we think could generalize. So the way we estimate what COVID was doing to people's wages, we actually use 2019 wage activity in a given month. We bring it forward for the same worker. And this is sort of the control. Okay, this is what enables us to estimate counterfactual wages for the worker. Now, I can show plots. I do have them that show that wages are highly seasonal. So month by month, you see very stable patterns in terms of when wages vary over time in a given year. They do rise systematically, but the dynamics are very consistent, which supports using them in this way for this research design. So treatment here is essentially, at least when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic, is it 2020 or not? Time in this estimation is going to be calendar months. So is it January and February, which is the pre-period, or is it March, April, May, which is the post-period? Okay. Within that simple difference in difference setup, we'll then look at subgroups, right? Which you could think of these as moderators or not, but essentially, are you a worker who would eventually be placed into a remote working relationship for your employer or not? Combined with, do you have high computing skills or not? Combined with, do other people in your household have high computing skills or not? So these are the definition of the various subgroups we're going to be looking at over time, okay? And what we're really focused on is heterogeneity across these groups, as opposed to maybe the main effects for lots of reasons. Okay, so hopefully this is clear. I can pause here for a second if anyone does have a question about this research design.
I think we're good.
Okay. All right.
Can I jump in just quickly? This is Larry White. What about the bus driver who they no longer need him to drive the bus? They furlough him or her and send him or her home. Where does that bus driver fit into your structure here?
So that bus driver is going to be in the no telework category. Now, the reality is, if 100% of bus drivers essentially can't be teleworked, that means that when we, fixed effect within that job category, they're basically going to get wiped out of the data set. They're not going to contribute to the estimates.
Okay.
Okay. Yep. Good question. Okay. So you maybe want to know, how do I know, or how am I operationalizing remote work, and how am I operationalizing technical skills and things like this? All of this is very important. So first off, just understand our sample and the data that we're working with. So this is a lot of linked administrative data at the individual level. So the main source of sampling bias that may crop up here derives from this middle point among employers, this IREE survey. This is the starting point of our sampling. It's very Portuguese. It roughly translates into English as something like rapid and exceptional business survey. The survey was begun with the onset of the pandemic to keep a pulse, like a thumb on the pulse of the economy in Portugal. So the survey captures responses from private employers who are intended to be a representative cross-section of all industries in Portugal, and also a cross-section of firms by size. So these almost 9,000 firms, they run the gamut from very large employers to quite small employers, and they span all industries. So if you worked for one of these Portuguese firms that answered this survey, and they all had to answer by law, if you worked for one of them and you paid taxes indicating that you worked for this firm in 2017, okay, you get into our sample potentially. This is the first point. Now, assuming this is the case, understand, of course, our estimations will be conducted at the worker level. So this means our sample will be biased towards bigger firms, bigger employers, because they'll have more employees who end up in the sample. Okay, it is what it is. If you get into the sample at this point, now the question is, you still needed to be working for the same firm in April of 2020. Okay, so you have persistent employment relationship over time. We get your monthly wage data, gross wages. We also have several other things that we link to you. So we link your educational records. So if you went to school at a university, for instance, in Portugal, we would know what degree you got. We also have job codes, so ISCO job codes from Europe, which we will map to ONET roughly equivalent job codes to be able to make use of worker job characteristic surveys to understand something about the degree to which you work with computers, et cetera, for instance. We also merge in expenditure data from value-added tax records. So essentially, it is the case in Portugal that for the vast majority of purchases, you are supposed to report your VAT number to the retailer when you make a purchase. It doesn't always happen, but people have an incentive to do so. It feeds into, for instance, there are regular lotteries that happen where a VAT receipt with your number on it is a ticket in the lottery, this kind of stuff. So it creates economic incentive to report purchases. So we can essentially create measures of spending by an individual in categories. And in particular, what will be important here is we can construct a measure of household spending on ICT and telecommunications. So maybe to account for the infrastructure that's better in your house or something like that, that we might be worried about. Now, the other thing we do is we actually then link people. So anybody that was filing taxes at the exact same tax address, we identify you as part of sort of the cohabitation network. And this is where we're really going to be worried about who are these people and what skills do they have, so we can estimate the spillovers we're worried about. Okay. Our final sample where we need at least 2 people at the same tax address who both worked for an employer that answered this survey. That's our probably most selected aspect of this sample. That narrows us down to roughly 48,000 people. Okay, our starting point, just to be clear for context, there are about 500,000 people who work for one of the employers that answer this survey. So we're getting down to about 10% of that sample when we get to these pairs. And it is by and large almost exclusively dyads. It's very rare that we get more than 2 people in a household that are working for one of these employers. Okay. So,
sorry, can I just?
You may.
So I didn't get the last point. So do you get a lot of households where 2 household members work for the same firm? Or the other way around?
Not so much that they work for the same firm, but where they both work for an employer who answered the survey. Could be 2 different firms though. Okay,
and do you see, so you don't see a lot that work for the same firm, because that might be even a different spillover?
That's relatively rare.
Okay.
It does happen, but you're probably talking hundreds or thousands of people as opposed to, many thousands. So we don't exploit it so much. We do look at industry, like same versus different industry. We will look at that heterogeneity. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So the measures that we're going to use to construct the first focal measure that we think about are based on ONET job characteristics for the job you hold, based on mapping from the ISCO code that we have for you. And in particular, there's 3 questions we focus on from the ONET skills surveys, which basically pick up on, for a given job, to what extent does it involve using or knowledge of computers/technology? And we essentially construct a measure that aggregates over the response to these 3 questions to construct a normalized measure of the degree to which the job involves working with computers. And then we dichotomize it into high-low, just to create our DID groups, subgroups on the basis of this measure. Now, this is one measure that we're going to use. A second measure that we will use that I'll explain is essentially tied to the degree you earned in university, which is manually categorized as being technology related or STEM. Okay, a STEM degree. And we get consistent results using each of these approaches, as you will see. This is just correlation essentially between these 2 different approaches to constructing the measure. They're highly correlated with each other. So the job you get, unsurprisingly, is tied to the type of degree you got at university. Okay, so here's the descriptive statistics for our household peer sample, as we call it. There's roughly 25,000 households involved here. Average gross wages, we're talking 1,800 euros. I will note that this is very similar to the value we get if we use the broader sample of 500,000 people that work for one of these firms. It doesn't change things much. The average worker is 45 years old. It's almost exactly 50% male. Family size is inclusive of the worker. So this is household size inclusive of a particular focal worker. There's on average 3.15 people. This can include dependents and things. Average number of dependents is there. What's interesting here? Assignment into remote work. This is actually going to be based, by the way, I should have mentioned this, is based on one of the answers to that IREE survey. This is why we started off focusing on that survey in our sampling criteria. There was a question on that survey where employers were asked, what fraction of your employees are presently working remotely? And it's a discretized response. It goes from exactly 0%, more than 0, less than 10, from 10 to 25, 25 to 50, 50 to 75, 75 plus. Okay. And we call you high if the firm reports more than 50% and low if it's below, less than or equal to. Of course, there's measurement error here because just because your employer said 3/4 were working from home, that doesn't mean a particular worker was working from home. It's more probabilistic in some sense as a way of thinking about this. We will need to be worried about that measurement error though. So based on that measure, about 20% of the workers in our sample worked for an employer that said more than half the employees were at home. That's what this number means. And about 45% had high computing skills, okay, according to our measure. This is the ONET style measure that I talked about. Okay, this is the main regression specification we're going to estimate with this data. So again, year of 2020 is sort of the COVID treatment. 2019 is control. Calendar months are the time we're going to be thinking about in this difference in difference estimation. In the bottom right here, we have individual fixed effects. We'll have dyad fixed effects. Actually, we'll have differential trends that we incorporate flexibility to allow your wages to vary as a function of how old are you, what's your gender, what's your level sort of in the hierarchy of the firm, these types of measures to allow sort of flexibility for these things to be sucked up from the results. And the main thing we're going to care about is these three-way interactions, essentially. When the post period begins in 2020, are you at a firm that's assigning the majority of people to remote work? And do you have high computing skills? The final estimate, the second last from the bottom there, delta 2, essentially looking at the same thing, but do you lack computing skills yet have somebody else in the household that has them? Okay, that's the spillover effect. And it's not listed here, but we will actually estimate the interaction that includes between peer and own skills as well. Okay, hopefully this is clear. And what do we find? And I will zoom in on this in just a sec. I just wanted to show though that we're running these sort of stepwise regressions, incorporating all these differential trends and adding fixed effects and things to show, the results are relatively stable when we do this. First of all, having computing skills of your own when you do get assigned into remote work that has a wage benefit, right? Or you suffer less, at least in your wages monthly, if that's the case. So these are log wage outcomes. The estimate of the spillover effect is also there, positive and significant. The two estimates are not significantly different from one another, but if you just want to look at the point estimates directly, it's about 3/4 of the magnitude of having the skill yourself if you have somebody else in the house that has them. Now, something notable here, which is, we were surprised to see this when we did see this, there is no substitution here. If you look at the third estimate, it's basically a fairly precise null. And it masks some heterogeneity that I will talk about when I get to the same versus different industry interactions, that heterogeneity. But the other thing is when we use a matched sample on a lot of different things about the worker and their household cohabitants, the substitution does show up once we do that. And the substitution effect will show up when we use an education-based measure of computing skills. So there's something else maybe being picked up on with this job-based measure that we're not capturing as well, potentially. Now, notice I'm also conditioning on IT expenditures toward the bottom and telecom expenditures. So this is in no way going to be influenced by household ICT quality or something like this. And this is just zooming in so you can see more clearly what's going on with these estimates. I've cut out all the other estimates. Okay, so we're talking about 4 to 6% wage benefits. Here's what we see when we do use a degree-based measure of computing skill instead of a job-based measure. So the pattern of effects is quite similar. The main distinction, as I mentioned, being that you do here see substitution. So it's not strictly additive like we were seeing in the last set of estimates. How do we construct this measure? So this was taking a list of STEM certified or designated degrees from the US Department of Veterans Affairs and mapping equivalents in Portugal. Miguel went through and did this. The number of degrees is not so exorbitant, so doing this manually was not that much time and effort. Okay, and so the pattern of effects is quite similar when we do this. This is just for visualization. It's not extremely important, but essentially this is just subgroup estimations. So rather than comparing them to each other, we're just taking the subgroup. If you have any skills in the house, no skills in the house, only the household peer has it, only I have it, or everybody's got it. What are the different effects we get from being assigned into remote work? That difference in difference estimation. And it follows the pattern that you would have expected from the coefficient estimates I was just showing a minute ago. Here are the dynamics over time.
Gordon,
Yes.
can I ask a question about this?
may.
So you said something about the fixed effects in the very beginning, but I'm still wondering these own wage effects. To what extent, because I think these skills, you define them by the job description, right? And to what extent these could be driven by the fact that jobs with more like telework related job description are less likely to use this wage scheme, where you got the social security wage payment, and to what so the peer skills, I think that makes sense. That's probably fine, but the own wage, I'm wondering, if the control group maybe doesn't have a larger drop in wages, because more workers in firms that have lower technology requirements, they are more likely to use this social security financed wage scheme, or can you exclude that somehow? Did I miss that?
Well, so this is within a job, right? So given I have this type of job and I'm assigned into remote work versus not in the data.
But and is that so? All observations in the sample, or I guess my question then rather is, so how much variation do you have within the job for this?
That's a good question. I mean, so that varies quite heavily across industry sectors and things like this. So that shows up in the results of these surveys. It's not something that we've quantified in the paper directly, but it is descriptively, there's a lot actually.
Okay.
But you're right. Like, to the extent that there's more variation in some types of industries and jobs than others, those where it is present will drive our estimates more.
Okay, would be good. I don't know if the data allow this, but it would be great to see some heterogeneity there, unless you will go into that.
So I'm not about to go into that, but it's a good point. It's something that data would enable. So we do know, for instance, the sector you work in and things like that, we could exploit that. So this is just month by month estimates in that first lockdown. So the effects, even though the lockdown began mid-March, March 15th, the effects do not show up mostly in the wages of that month. They tend to show up primarily in April, and then they start to fade essentially in May when the lockdowns were relaxed. The point why this might be interesting to note is that it's not necessarily the case that the furlough decisions were being made exclusively based on sort of pre-knowledge that the employer may have had about the workers' abilities or their expectations. A lot of this was happening dynamically. Of course, this will also reflect that the challenges the businesses were facing were arising dynamically. So maybe things got really bad in April, for example. Okay, but the effects are showing up, it's not, they're here and they stay flat. There's some dynamics going on here. I have other estimates I can show. I know I've only got 5 minutes. I have other estimates I can show if I have time, where we show the effects happen in the first lockdown. If you look at the period following the first lockdown, the effects go away. And then the subsequent lockdown, the effects come back. Now here's the heterogeneity by, do the people that live with me work in the same industry or not? Okay, so the first column of estimates here is just a point of reference for what's going on if we ignore same industry heterogeneity, and then we see how do things shift once we incorporate heterogeneity by a shared industry. And what you see happens is, so looking towards the estimates circled in orange, essentially, if I have high computing skills and I'm in a firm that has a lot of remote work going on, so I'm likely to have been sent home, I have some benefit for myself and my wages from that being the case. However, this is only true if the other person in my household does not work in the same industry as me. If the other person in my household works in a different industry, okay, or sorry, if this is only true if they don't work in the same industry as me. If the other person in the house lacks computing skills and they work in my industry, there's a penalty that happens, presumably because I'm supporting them. I'm more likely to be helping them because I know their industry and they lack skills. If they are not in my industry, I kind of am doing better personally because I have less ability to support them. This is sort of the idea. Conversely, if I lack computing skills, so the green estimates, I lack computing skills, but the other people in my house have them, but they're not in my industry. It's a positive estimate, but it's not significant. If they do work in the same industry as me, I get a benefit from them. So this suggests that the spillover effects, when they're happening, they're very much more likely tied to being in the same industry as somebody else versus not. And it's not strictly a benefit. There is a penalty that happens for the person doing the support, potentially. The benefit to them of their own skills are not quite as strong, which is somewhat consistent with what we would expect to see happening, actually, and sort of consistent with the spillover support mechanism we're talking about. Now, everything I've talked about so far is tied to this notion of gross wages. We do have some ability to separate those wages between base wages and discretionary supplements like bonuses and commissions and things like this. Why is that important? Because you might be worried that people conducting remote work, maybe they just start working more hours, and as a result, they get paid more. Okay, so that would show up as wage extras, sort of discretionary overtime and things like that is where it'd come in, as opposed to base wage. So we can do something a bit coarse. Essentially, once a year in October of each year, there is a monthly wage report that gets provided by employers into a different data set that tells you in that month what was the base wage and what were the discretionary wages for the worker. So we can do some monthly comparison in our period of observation to that 2018 breakdown in October, and we bring that value forward with inflation. And we essentially say, if the gross wages you are earning right now in this month in 2020 are lower than the inflated base wages from 2018, we think you had a furlough because your base wages got cut. It couldn't have happened otherwise. So that gives us a binary indicator of, did you have a base pay cut? Similarly, we can construct a measure of whether you were earning wage extras or like they were non-zero by taking the 2018 gross wages, bringing them forward with inflation, and then seeing, do you make more than that gross now? And this gives us a noisy measure of, did you earn wage extras this period? So these are binary outcomes we're studying. And basically what we're showing is the effect on furlough probability is there, right? So if you just look at base wage cuts, we see the same pattern of effects going on. You're less likely to have had a base wage cut or furlough, essentially, if you had computing skills. And similarly, if somebody else in your household had computing skills, the spillover. You're also less likely to have earned extras or more likely to have earned extras as a function of having these computing skills, which may suggest that people were able to put in more hours, essentially. Okay, so both of these things can be going on, but our results are not just explained by people's ability to work more when they're remote. So I have several robustness checks and things. We validate our measure of telework against gas expenditure in the household and show that, the high telework people spend way less on gas, although honestly, it's less common for people to drive to work in Portugal. So this is not the best measure. That's why we don't use it directly. We also, because we might be concerned about measurement error in the telework variable, again, because it's an employer level measure, we do an exercise where we focus on people who worked for employers where the employer said either 0% of our employees are at home or more than 75%, because we'll have relatively less measurement error and the results replicate when we do this. Several other things, we incorporate partner wages, which we instrument with the partner's coworkers' wages. Okay, and we do find positive effects of partner wages on own wages. So there's some complementarity there of some sort, right? We also, like I said, incorporate these controls for ICT spend, et cetera, within the household. None of this destroys the effects. Oh, and we condition on dependence in the household as well, by the way. And that also, because you may be worried that there'd be a degree of freedom in the household if we have two parents at home. It's easier to manage the kid and then people can be more productive. So controlling for dependence doesn't change things. Course and exact matching on lots of things about education and demographics and stuff for the person and the other people in the house. So we make this matched sample. and our results persist. And again, we have the substitution effect is here, okay? Even when we're using the job-based technology skill measure. And then finally, because I know I'm very low on time, we do pre-trend type tests to make sure effects are not showing up before the onset of the telework assignments, and they don't appear. We also, here's the first lockdown, then relaxation, then second lockdown. We see effects that go away, they come back, although more weakly, either because people have learned something the first time around, or because the lockdown was not as strict the second time around. So there's a couple of reasons why the effect could get weaker the second time. And we can check if the partner is more likely to have been at home because their employer had majority sent home versus not. This is less convincing because these effects are not statistically different from each other, but the point estimates are only significant when we think the partner was at home versus not. Now, of course, the partner doesn't need to be at home to provide you with support. They could help you after hours. So there's another reason to think that this is not purely a placebo check or anything, but it's a pattern consistent with what we'd expect. Okay, so with that, I'll just wrap up here quickly. Essentially, the main takeaway here, and again, I apologize for going a little bit long, is that this information is important for both thinking about government planning and for employer planning. On the government side, there's been a bunch of money that's been earmarked recently, both in the EU and in North America, towards upskilling workers with digital literacy. And so the point here is that maybe some thought needs to be given to how you allocate those funds and those training investments. Is it worker level, or do you think about doing this at the household level potentially? For an employer, it may be important to think about not just the skills of my workforce, but whether they have access to alternative sources of support. Now, question as to how you might go about gauging that. It's sort of interesting. Anecdotally, we have heard examples of this in Portugal where people's employers ask them sort of very blatantly, is there someone there at home who can help you because we don't have the sort of shared IT support to be able to do stuff for you right now? So this question was sort of asked explicitly and may have affected people's furlough likelihood. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thank you for listening. I do want to leave a few minutes for questions should they exist.
Thanks a lot, Gordon. I think you were actually right on time because we started like a minute late. So this was perfect. So I have a question, but there's also, so Luis Cabral, he wrote a bit of a longer, more of a comment than a question. Luis, feel free to unmute yourself. Otherwise, I would maybe just for the recording read this out, and maybe Gordon, you want to comment.
Sure.
So Luis wrote, even by European standards, the Portuguese labor market is highly regulated and inefficient. So the working assumption that wages reflect productivity, yeah, you should maybe qualify that further. Moreover, so Luis believes that you assume the furlough decision is one-sided. So the question is then, is it possible that it results from some sort of negotiation between worker and firm? If so, is it possible that there's some reverse causality going on? For example, household conditions affect outside options, bargaining power, and thus the likelihood of a work from home agreement is reached. Do you have thoughts on that?
Jointly, yeah. So the main thing I would say to that latter comment. So the first comment is certainly valid. The question is whether the Portuguese economy really reflects other economies. That's a question of generalizability, I guess, and it's a valid one. Now, to the question of whether this is maybe some kind of negotiation and there's workers preferring to opt into working from home when they know maybe they'll have a better ability to survive or succeed. That's certainly true. One thing that's worth noting is that basically most of the workers, I think they get roughly 21 days of vacation that they can take that would be fully paid at 100% salary. And so my understanding is the vast majority of workers, if they did have a preference for staying at home, would have begun that way to maintain full wages as opposed to taking a 30% wage cut. Now, what you say, therefore, might have begun to manifest later, that workers may have preferred to be at home because they thought they'd be more capable. Well, maybe I'm conflating two things, I guess. So there's two things that are going on. So one is negotiation around telework or negotiation around furlough. So those are sort of two separate things to be worried about, I guess. Negotiation around the furlough, I think, would be predominantly a concern later in the first lockdown. The effects would not show up right away. But to your point, they may have influenced our estimates sort of in the aggregate. And there's not much we can do to pick up on that, essentially, if it was happening.
So thanks. So Sebastian, Steffen, he raised his hand. Please go ahead and unmute yourself. And then Michael, why don't you unmute yourself after?
Thanks for your presentation, board. One question I had about the mechanisms here. It's due to the pandemic, it might have been easier for remotable workers to switch jobs, right? That could have potentially led to like more pressures on companies to raise wages. Is that something you're able to look into with this? And then the other question is whether you were able to use like Lima as well as a measure for work from home mobility of jobs.
So the question of job change and labor mobility and things like that. So I can say that it's extremely rare in our sample that people dropped out of the sample because they changed employers. So by and large, if they did change employers, they would have exited the sample because it would be relatively rare they would go to another employer in our data set. If they dropped out, they become missing values in our data. But we do have some analyses we do in the paper to make sure that these people are not really affecting our estimates because they're relatively small sample. Now, as far as alternative measures of the teleworkability, so we have not explored the alternative measure that you're mentioning. We could. All we've done at the moment are these education-based measures, and then the measure I described earlier from the ONET data. And the third thing that we're thinking about constructing as a measure of telework is actually trying to base it on household expenditures or the personal expenditure data to see if we can predict if you were at home or not on the basis of how you're spending and what you're spending on, if that makes sense. We can do this because there's sort of other data sets that are worker level where people report, I am at home in my work right now versus not, and that can be linked to expenditure activity. So we can try and train a classifier essentially to predict this at the worker level. So this is the third thing we're exploring right now.
Cool. Yeah, I'd love to use some of your guys' measure maybe for some robustness checks for our paper. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for the questions. Thank you.
Hi, my question is about your 10% sample, and is it possible to resurrect some of the rest of the sample by comparing the dyads to the singletons who are similar to them? Yeah, there's got to be some sort of selection into cohabitation.
True. Well, so the cohabitation thing is hard for us to address. So we don't just have a selection on cohabitation. We have double selection, right? We have selection on cohabitation and you work for one of these companies. So I can only really speak to the second point of selection. Do you show up with both people having an employer in the data set? Because we have run models where we relax that requirement. And all that really matters is that we don't know anything about the telework status of the other people in the house, but we do know their skill sets and things. So we can run that estimation with 500,000 people and the results actually replicate fairly well. That said, I can't say much about how, right now in the moment at least, about how these workers may differ from people that don't have other people in their household. It's a fair point. They may be systematically different, but then of course they won't have these spillovers to benefit from anyway. So it's a question as to whether we would worry about that population. Of course, people get married and divorced.
Well, they become the comparison group because they can't have the spillovers.
I see. So you're saying they're, yeah. So you're right. There may be some sort of statistical power benefit from retaining those at least who look similar to cohabitating people. It's something, yeah, we haven't done that. It's a good suggestion.
Great. So Dan Vishnori had his hand up next, and then Larry, please after that, go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. 2 questions on the spillover effects. The first, more of a clarification. So I see the computer skills from the worker side, but if I understood correctly, the home working remotely decision is done by the firm. So is the idea that the firm learns over time that there is somebody else in the household and therefore performance is better? Or how is this the mechanism from the firm side, right? And maybe the second question with regard to spillover effects, I wondered about the whole parenting stuff. And because also like kindergartens closed down, yes, and whether this is somehow ruled out or whether this is in the data, that would also be interesting. Thanks.
Yeah. So to the question of how the firm kind of learns about this and how it influences their choices, I think there's actually two mechanisms. So one is the employee explicitly telling the employer, like, I need help and there's nobody in my house that can help me with this. Like that kind of conversation, we know for sure that would happen to some extent. It was taking place. The second, though, is it would not be direct observation. So the employer may not know exactly why you're doing better or having a harder time, but they just see that you are, right? So this is the idea. And they make dynamic choices about, well, if we need to make a cash flow constrained choice about who we're going to keep here and who we're going to let be on leave, I'm going to pick you, not you, because you're just doing better in the situation. So some of it would be sort of dynamic. So it would be these dual channels, I think. To your question about childcare, yeah, this is a big one. So essentially, if maybe both of you have technology skills in the household, both of you can be remote workers. And as a result, you can both be there and have an easier time managing a child at home or something. And then both people get to be more productive. That might be a concern that this would confound the spillover. We do have estimations where we essentially we condition on the presence of dependents in the household versus not. And the effects are there even if there are no dependents, essentially, which is, that may have played a role, but it's not driving all our results, basically. Yeah.
Okay. Partly a comment, partly a question.
Yep.
The comment, computing skills are clearly central to your study. I was immediately struck that you had what sounded like a continuous measure, and then you chose to dichotomize it. And it wasn't clear why. At a minimum, I would suggest robustness checks, varying your dichotomization point to see whether that makes a difference or not. But also, why throw away information? Maybe stay with your continuous variable. That doesn't mean you have to force a linear relationship. You could see what happens when you log that variable or you take it to an exponent or something. But it feels like you're throwing away information. And at a minimum, you have to think about robustness. So that's my comment.
Sure.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
That was a comment. Okay, question. Yes.
Right. You meant I lost the predicate to substitution. What was the substitution effect that your data were sometimes capturing?
I mean, I think the substitution effect would just be that the skills, if both of us are cohabitating and both of us have high skills, then it's quite likely a lot of those skills will be redundant. So the benefit I would acquire from you is canceled out because I don't need it, essentially. Okay. All right. So that was that. So as far as this question of continuous and why do we dichotomize and throw away information, point taken. I mean, I'm also of the mind that you should never throw away information. I think the main rationale, what we're doing here is I don't have a lot of faith that the continuous variation in that measure is very trustworthy. Like I wouldn't want to exploit it very heavily because it's a very noisy measure. Because we're taking multiple survey responses and we're doing this weighted combination and then we're aggregating over them. And so you will get variation in the continuous.
That's why you do robustness.
Yes, sure. I agree. It would be worthwhile to incorporate robustness checks where we don't dichotomize. Yeah.
Or dichotomize at different points along your measure.
Assess sensitivity. Yeah.
Robustness checks. It looks like your results are going to hold up, but so you don't deal with questions from people like me. Bring that into your analysis.
Fair. Thank you.
Fantastic. That was a good final word, I think, by Larry. So thanks again, Gordon, for presenting here. I think this was an exciting presentation.